Now listen carefully, because there is a moment when heaven grows quiet, not because God has stopped working, but because God is waiting for you to recognize that everything has already been arranged except one final surrender. You have prayed, you have waited, you have endured, you have believed through nights that stretched longer than your strength, and you have wondered why the door has not yet opened. But what if I tell you that the delay is not denial, and the silence is not absence, and the pressure you feel right now is not meant to crush you, but to extract the last thing that must be released? There is one more thing, just one more thing, and when it is released, everything changes. You see, God does not work randomly. God does not respond to panic, noise, or desperation. God responds to alignment. When your heart, your words, your expectations, and your obedience come into harmony with the will of God, release is inevitable. Not gradual, not partial, not delayed. Release comes suddenly, like a dam breaking after holding back a river for years. Many people stand so close to their breakthrough that the sound of freedom is already echoing in the spirit. Yet they step back because they refuse to let go of the last thing God is asking for. They want blessing without surrender, promotion without obedience, increase without trust. But God does not negotiate with fear. There are seasons when God allows you to struggle, not because God is testing your pain tolerance, but because God is refining your perception. You think the struggle is about provision, but God knows it is about position. You think the struggle is about resources, but God knows it is about readiness. You think the struggle is about time, but God knows it is about trust. God will never release something into your life that would destroy you if you received it too early. Delay is not punishment. Delay is preparation. And preparation always feels uncomfortable because it requires you to outgrow the version of yourself that is no longer sufficient for where God is taking you. You have asked God for change, but God is asking you for release. Release the bitterness you have justified. Release the fear you have normalized. Release the control you pretend is wisdom. Release the identity that was built in survival mode and can no longer function in abundance. God is not withholding from you. God is waiting for you to let go. Heaven is not closed. Your hands are simply full. And when your hands are full of what you refuse to release, you cannot receive what God is ready to pour. Understand this deeply. God moves when faith becomes action, not when faith becomes noise. There are people who pray loudly but live cautiously. There are people who declare boldly but obey selectively. God is not moved by your volume. God is moved by your surrender. The moment you release the one thing you keep protecting, the one thing you keep defending, the one thing you keep calling necessary, even though God has been telling you it is unnecessary, that is the moment release begins. Because obedience unlocks what prayer alone cannot. There is a spiritual law at work that many do not want to accept. What you cling to out of fear becomes the very thing that delays your freedom. God has already spoken. God has already prepared the way. God has already positioned the opportunity. But you are still holding on to something that belongs to a previous season. You cannot step into a new season carrying the weight of an old one. God does not recycle seasons. When God says move, staying becomes disobedience. When God says release, holding on becomes rebellion disguised as caution. Some of you are tired not because you are doing too much, but because you are carrying what God never asks you to carry. You are exhausted from trying to control outcomes that God already secured. You are drained from maintaining appearances that God never required. You are weary because you are fighting battles that surrender would end instantly. God is not asking you to fight harder. God is asking you to trust deeper. Trust is not passive. Trust is active release. Let me speak clearly. God is not impressed by how long you can endure something God already told you to release. Endurance is only virtuous when it is aligned with obedience. Suffering that comes from disobedience does not produce reward. It produces delay. God's desire is not for you to be strong in pain, but to be free in obedience. Freedom always follows release. Always, without exception. There is one more thing. It may be a thought pattern that keeps you trapped in yesterday. It may be a relationship that feeds your insecurity instead of your purpose. It may be an identity formed in failure that God already redeemed. It may be a fear of losing control, of being misunderstood, of stepping into responsibility that feels larger than your comfort. Whatever it is, you know it. God has already pointed to it. God has already brought it to your attention repeatedly. Every time you avoid it, the pressure increases, not to punish you, but to guide you. Pressure is often the mercy of God. Pressure exposes what? Cannot go where God is taking you. Pressure reveals attachments you did not realize were chains. Pressure brings clarity when comfort would keep you stagnant. If God wanted to destroy you, there would be no pressure, only collapse. Pressure means something valuable is being formed. Something powerful is being prepared. Something significant is about to be released. You must understand that release is not loss. Release is transfer. When you release what God asks for, God transfers you into a higher dimension of trust, authority, and peace. What feels like loss in the moment becomes gain in the outcome. God never asks for something without already preparing something greater in return. The problem is that faith cannot calculate the exchange in advance. Faith releases first and understands later. Many people say they trust God, but trust is not proven by words spoken in safety. Trust is proven by obedience, chosen in uncertainty. When God says release, and you cannot see what comes next, that is the moment your faith becomes real. That is the moment heaven responds. God is drawn to faith that moves without guarantees, faith that acts without evidence, faith that releases without knowing the timing. You are closer than you think. The reason the resistance has intensified is because the release is near. Opposition does not increase when you are far from breakthrough. It increases when you are about to cross the line. The final barrier is always the hardest because it guards the greatest release. Do not misinterpret resistance as failure. Resistance is confirmation that you are moving in the right direction. God is not asking you to understand everything. God is asking you to obey one thing, one more thing, not 10, not everything at once, just one. And when that one thing is released, clarity will come, provision will come, peace will come, direction will come, momentum, it'll come. What you have been praying for will begin to move with speed that makes the waiting feel insignificant. Some of you have been asking God for a sign, but God has been asking you for surrender. The sign is not coming before the release. The sign comes after. Faith does not follow evidence. Evidence follows faith. God's pattern has never changed. Release precedes manifestation. Obedience precedes provision. Surrender precedes elevation. There are moments when God waits quietly, not because God is distant, but because God respects your will. God will not force release. God will invite it, highlight it, press it upon your heart, but God will not take it from you. Love does not coerce. Love waits. And the waiting of God is not weakness, it is honor. God honors your choice even when that choice delays your breakthrough. Do not underestimate the power of one obedient act. One release can undo years of stagnation. One surrender can break cycles that have repeated for generations. One step of obedience can move you from survival into purpose. God does not need you to fix everything. God needs you to release one thing. When you release, you are not stepping into emptiness. You are stepping into alignment. Alignment creates flow. Flow creates movement. Movement creates manifestation. The reason things have felt stuck is not because God has stopped, but because alignment has been incomplete. One more thing completes it. One more thing unlocks it. One more thing releases it. And even now, as these words settle in your spirit, you feel it. Not as condemnation, not as fear, but as clarity. You know what God is asking. You know what has been highlighted again and again. You know what you have postponed, justified, delayed. This is not coincidence. This is invitation. God is not calling you out. God is calling you up. Release is not humiliation. Release is elevation. W. Hen, you let go of what limits you. God releases what empowers you. When you release what you can control, God releases what you cannot create. When you release what you fear losing, God releases what fear has been blocking. There is a divine urgency in this moment. Not panic, not pressure born of anxiety, but urgency born of opportunity. The door is not closing, the door is opening. But you cannot walk through carrying what belongs outside. Lay it down. Trust the process. Honor the instruction. Release the one more thing. And watch how suddenly what was delayed begins to move. How what was heavy becomes light. How what was impossible becomes inevitable. How what was restrained is released into motion, unfolding, expanding, accelerating, as God brings alignment, peace, authority, and forward movement into every area where you dared to obey and let go, stepping fully into what has already been prepared, already ordained, already waiting, already set in motion by God. What many fail to realize is that God often hides release inside responsibility. You think freedom will come when pressure lifts, but God knows freedom comes when your capacity expands. The weight you feel is not meant to break you. It is meant to train you. God never releases something into a life that has not first learned how to carry it with humility, wisdom, and reverence. That is why the final instruction often feels inconvenient, uncomfortable, and even illogical. God is not trying to make sense to your comfort. God is shaping your character for what is coming next. There is a level of blessing that cannot coexist with compromise. God is patient, but God is precise. When God prepares a release, everything misaligned must be addressed, not later, not eventually, but now. You may wonder why God keeps returning to the same issue, the same habit, the same fear, the same unresolved obedience. It is because, say, that issue sits at the threshold of your next season. God will not decorate a door that will not open. God will not pour new wine into a vessel that refuses to be reshaped. You have been asking for expansion, but expansion requires stretching. Stretching is never comfortable because it confronts the limits you have grown accustomed to. God stretches your thinking so your faith can breathe. God stretches your obedience so your trust can mature. God stretches your patience so your endurance can deepen. Stretching hurts only when you resist it. When you surrender to it, stretching becomes growth, and growth always precedes release. Understand this truth deeply. God is not intimidated by your questions, but God is unmoved by excuses. You can ask God anything, but you cannot negotiate obedience. When God speaks clearly, delay becomes a decision, and decisions have consequences. Not punishment, not rejection, but timing. What could have unfolded swiftly begins to unfold slowly when obedience hesitates. God's mercy covers you, but alignment accelerates you. Some of you are standing in a moment where God is asking you to act before you feel ready. Readiness is often revealed after obedience, not before. If you wait until you feel confident, you may never move. Confidence is not the prerequisite. Trust is. God does not call the confident. God cultivates confidence in those who obey despite uncertainty. The release you are waiting for is waiting on your movement. There are times when God intentionally strips away familiar supports so you can discover a deeper reliance. Not because those supports were evil, but because they were temporary. What once helped you survive may now be limiting your growth. God is not ungrateful for the past. God is intentional about the future. When God asks you to release what once sustained you, it is because God is about to become your sustainer in a new way. You must recognize the difference between faith and nostalgia. Nostalgia keeps you loyal to what God has already finished. Faith keeps you responsive to what God is doing now. God does not move backward to meet you where you were. God moves forward and invites you to follow. When you cling to what feels familiar, you delay what is destined. Release is the language of faith spoken without words. There is also a sacred humility in release. When you release, you are declaring that God knows better than your logic, your timing, and your preferences. You are saying that obedience matters more than comfort, that alignment matters more than applause, that purpose matters more than preservation. God honors humility because humility creates space for divine influence. Pride closes doors that prayer alone cannot open. Some have mistaken delay for rejection and silence for absence. But God has been closer than you think, watching how you steward the waiting, how you speak in uncertainty, how you respond when instructions challenge your sense of control. Waiting is not empty time. Waiting is revealing time. It reveals what you truly trust, what you truly value, and what you are truly willing to release. The final release often requires you to act without validation from others. When God speaks to you, God does not always explain it to everyone else. Obedience can feel lonely when it separates you from familiar voices. But solitude in obedience is better than crowds in compromise. God will confirm what you obey in private by releasing fruit in public. You must also understand that release is not only about what you let go of externally, but what you release internally. Release the resentment that has disguised itself as justice. Release the guilt that God already forgave. Release the shame that has no authority over a redeemed purpose. Release the fear that whispers lies about your limitations. God cannot release peace into a mind that refuses to release torment. There is a strength that comes when you stop arguing with God and start agreeing. Agreement with God realigns your inner world. Your thoughts settle. Your spirit steadies. Your direction sharpens. Confusion lifts not because answers suddenly appear, but because resistance dissolves. Agreement is powerful. Agreement activates movement. God does not require perfection. God requires willingness. Willingness opens the door that perfectionism keeps locked. When you are willing to obey even when your understanding is incomplete, God fills in what you cannot see. Willingness invites grace into the process. Grace does not remove responsibility. Grace empowers obedience. You are not behind. You are not forgotten. You are not disqualified. But you are being invited into a decisive moment. A moment where hesitation ends and alignment begins. A moment where the question shifts from when will God move to will I release? God is ready. Heaven is ready. The timing is waiting on your response. Do not measure release by noise. Some of the greatest movements of God begin quietly with a decision made in the depths of the heart. A silent surrender, a private yes, a quiet laying down. And from that unseen moment, visible change begins to unfold with precision, speed, and authority that cannot be stopped. When you release, do not look back to see what you left behind. Looking back reopens what obedience closed. Trust the wisdom of God enough to move forward without needing to revisit the cost. The cost was necessary. The release is worth it. God never wastes surrender. Every act of obedience is recorded, honored, and multiplied in ways you may not immediately recognize. There is a future unfolding that requires the version of you that only exists after release. Stronger in faith, clearer in vision, lighter in spirit, sharper in discernment, more anchored in trust. God is not trying to change who you are at the core. God is removing what has obscured it. Release reveals identity. Even now, momentum is building. Not because circumstances have changed, but because perspective has. When perspective shifts, movement follows. When movement begins, resistance loses power. And when resistance breaks, release flows freely, restoring joy where heaviness lived, clarity where confusion ruled, strength where weariness lingered, and forward motion where stagnation once stood, as everything aligns under the authority, wisdom, and perfect timing of God. There is a sacred tension that appears just before release, a tension that presses on the soul and exposes what has been hidden beneath routine and familiarity. God allows this tension not to torment you, but to awaken you. Comfort dulls discernment, but tension sharpens it. When you feel that inner stirring, that restlessness that refuses to be quiet, it is not confusion, it is invitation. God is stirring what has been dormant, calling forth courage that has been waiting for permission to rise. God speaks most clearly when distractions lose their power. That is why clarity often comes after loss, after disappointment, after plans collapse. What you called interruption was actually alignment in disguise. God removed what was loud so you could finally hear what is true. And now that truth is pressing against your heart, asking not for emotion, not for enthusiasm, but for decision. Decision is the doorway to release. Many people want transformation without confrontation, but God confronts what God intends to change. Not harshly, not cruelly, but truthfully. God shines light on areas you have learned to manage rather than surrender. Management keeps you functioning. Surrender sets you free. God does not want you to merely cope with life. God wants to release you into fullness. And fullness cannot coexist with hidden resistance. There are moments when obedience feels smaller than the promise, when the instruction feels insignificant compared to what you are believing for. But God often hides the greatest releases behind the simplest acts. A quiet decision, a disciplined choice, a resolved heart. Heaven responds not to drama, but to alignment. What seems small in your hands becomes powerful when placed in God's order. You must also recognize that release reshapes your authority. When you let go of what once controlled you, you gain authority over what once intimidated you. Fear loses its voice. Doubt loses its grip. The opinions of others lose their weight. Obedience establishes authority, and authority changes how life responds to you. You stop reacting and start directing, not through force, but through alignment with God's will. God does not rush processes, but God does not waste moments. Every season carries an instrument, action, and every instruction carries a key. Ignore the instruction, and the season feels endless. Honor the instruction, and the season completes its assignment. Completion releases transition. Transition releases expansion. Expansion releases fruit. God's design is intentional, layered, and precise. Some of you have been trying to carry both faith and fear, both trust and control, both obedience and backup plans. But divided commitment dilutes power. God calls for wholeness, not perfection. Wholeness means your heart is undivided, your direction is settled, your obedience is not conditional. When your yes no longer carries hesitation, heaven responds with clarity. There is also healing hidden in release. Healing does not always come by revisiting the wound. Sometimes healing comes by releasing the weight of carrying it. God is not asking you to forget what happened, but to release its authority over your future. Pain may have shaped you, but it does not get to define you. God defines you. And what God defines, pain cannot imprison. You may feel like you are standing at the edge of something unfamiliar, something that stretches your faith beyond what you have practiced before. That edge is not danger, it is transition. God stands at that edge, not pushing you, but waiting for your trust. When you step forward, You do not step alone. God meets obedience with presence, and presence changes everything. Do not confuse stillness with stagnation. Sometimes God stills your movement so your roots can deepen. Shallow roots cannot sustain great release. God deepens you before God expands you. Depth gives stability. Stability gives endurance. Endurance gives longevity. God is not preparing a moment for you. God is preparing a future. And as release draws near, your discernment sharpens. You begin to see clearly what aligns and what drains, what builds and what distracts. Wow. Tea belongs and what must be left behind. This clarity is a gift. Do not ignore it, honor it, act on it. God reveals so you can respond. When you finally release, you will realize that what you feared letting go of was already holding you back. Freedom often reveals itself only after the grip loosens. Peace settles in, not because everything is resolved, but because alignment has been restored. God does not promise ease, but God promises guidance. And guidance is enough. The moment of release is rarely dramatic, but its impact is undeniable. It alters direction, reshapes desire, reorders priority. You walk differently. You speak differently. You choose differently. Not because you are trying harder, but because you are finally aligned. Alignment simplifies what once felt overwhelming. God is calling you into a deeper agreement, a deeper trust, a deeper surrender that does not announce itself, but transforms everything it touches. One more thing released does not mean you are losing ground. It means you are clearing it, clearing space for wisdom, clearing space for authority, clearing space for what God has already determined to release into your life, unfolding steadily, purposefully, powerfully, as obedience continues to open doors that no resistance can close, and alignment carries you forward into everything God has prepared, is preparing, and is now setting into motion through your willingness to release and trust God completely. Now hear this with your whole being, not as information, but as invitation. This moment is not passing you by. It is standing before you asking for honesty, courage, and surrender. God is not distant from your struggle, and God is not indifferent to your longing. God has been walking with you through every unanswered question, every delay that tested your patience, every silence that forced you to listen deeper. And D, now the weight you feel is not the weight of defeat, it is the weight of decision. Heaven pauses not in uncertainty, but in expectancy, waiting for your response. Search your life without fear, because God already sees it with love. Look honestly at what you have been holding, what you have protected, what you have allowed to shape your choices. Ask yourself what God has been gently but persistently pointing to. This is not about shame, it is about freedom. God is not exposing you to condemn you, but to release you. The courage to release is the courage to trust that God's wisdom surpasses your understanding and God's timing surpasses your impatience. Do not wait for perfect conditions, perfect confidence, or perfect clarity. Perfect moments rarely arrive before obedience. Move with the light you have. Speak your yes even if your voice trembles. Lay it down even if your hands shake. God does not require strength to begin. Strength is given when you obey. What you place in God's hands does not disappear. it transforms. Let this be the moment where your faith becomes visible through action, where belief moves from intention to obedience. Let this be the moment where you stop asking God to change circumstances and allow God to change alignment. Release what God has asked for, not later, not eventually, but now, because now is the only place obedience lives. As you choose release, let peace replace striving. Let trust replace fear. Let clarity replace confusion. You are not stepping into the unknown. You are stepping into God's care. God has never failed to honor surrender, never ignored obedience, never abandoned those who trust fully. The path ahead does not require your control. It requires your faith. Walk forward lighter than you arrived. Walk forward unburdened by what no longer belongs to you. Walk forward with a heart open, hands empty, and spirit aligned. And as you do, let your life become the evidence that when one more thing is released, everything God has prepared is free to move, to unfold, to flow with purpose, peace, and power under the perfect wisdom and unwavering faithfulness of God.